The idea of overdiagnosis around autism is an absolute myth. At the moment in the UK, there's a stat that's used to say that 1.1% of the population are autistic. I think it could be a lot higher than that. I think it could be 10%. And I think one of the reasons that it is so low is because so many different groups get missed out on when it comes to diagnosis. One of the groups I want to focus on for this video is women and girls. So this is something I've been interested in now for about 15 years. There was a really good book I read by Leanne Holiday called Pretending to be Normal. I read it in our library at the National Autistic Society. I was like, oh, there's autistic women. They presented slightly differently from some of the men and boys I'd worked with. When I started working with autistic job seekers, it's about 2007, women that were diagnosed with autism would be telling me about situations and things they were doing to try to fit in. If you've been socialized as a girl in the UK, you might be expected to be a quiet girl, be a good girl, fit in, cause no problems. If you're an undiagnosed autistic girl at school, you might not present in that way to start with, but then you start realizing the way you are isn't going to be socially acceptable. You're not accepted by your peers. So you might try masking your true traits at who you are. I've also heard from lots of women who I worked with that are autistic that they'd mimic another girl in the class that they might see, well, she's popular, she seems to be getting on with people, I'm going to take on her personality. And sometimes that mimicking doesn't work as much when girls get to teenage years. And sometimes that can lead to being diagnosed with severe mental health issues, which isn't to say that undiagnosed autistic teenage girls aren't having those. I think they are, but I think they're having those because they're living in a world that doesn't understand them and they don't understand that world and how they're being treated. So they might be masking or mimicking. I mean, it's really about eradicating who you are externally to society and getting rid of all those traits. I've heard lots of autistic women say that they masked for so long that they actually don't know who they are anymore. They tried to take on a personality that would match society's values, the sort of neuromajority's values, the neurotypical value. And then when they get to a point when they're older perhaps, and they're like, well, who am I? So it's really interesting to think about that. Another reason that lots of autistic women and girls don't get diagnosed is because stereotypes around autism. Some of the stereotypes could include that it's just men and boys. In fact, there was some work done by Simon Baron-Cohen nearly 15 years ago that talked about autism being the extreme of the male brain. Lots of autistic women have said actually this held back them understanding that autism could be something that affected women and girls. And this idea of the extreme male brain, I think, was really that stereotype that autism is, like an IT worker, and that's the only representation of it. The other stereotypes might be that all autistic people don't make eye contact. Some autistic people do, some don't. It could depend on the context. And some women have said that that's not an issue for them at all. But then when they go and talk to their doctor, exploring the potential it could be autistic, then it's looked at as, well, you can't be autistic because you're making eye contact and you've got friends. The media representation around autism can often be things like Sheldon Cooper and the Big Bang Theory. Then a lot of women and girls aren't going to necessarily relate to that character, or a really old one like Rain Man. I've seen some boys and men mask. It's going to affect different gender identities as well. When we look at this 1.1% figure of autistic people in the UK, I think is a lot higher. And why is it important that we're talking about this topic? Lots of women have said to me that once they can access the diagnosis or even self-identify as autistic, then they've almost start to learn how to have a textbook for their own brain. They've tried to be something else all their lives, and they realize they're not a broken human, that there's this way of being that was always them, and that's okay. If you've been brought up in society to mask your true identity, mimicking other people, then that's really going to affect things like self-esteem, anxiety, and depression. I think we have had generations of women thinking of their broken humans. I believe it's important that we live in a society where access to neurodivergent neurotypes, the diagnosis of those neurotypes, is equitable amongst all gender identities. One of the reasons this can be important is many autistic women I've spoken to have said since they had a diagnosis or since they self-identified with this neurotype, it was like getting a textbook to their brain. As a society, we've always tried to shoehorn autistic neurotypes into the neuromajority. Once people get a diagnosis, it helps them lean into their strengths. A lot of autistic people have said once they've understood their brain, they've been able to lean into those strengths and perhaps get support in areas they find challenging or maybe avoid situations that they were forcing themselves into because they felt like they had to. I think if you want to continue your conversation around this, I've seen lots of good advocates on social media these days that are women. If we're looking at representation, a really good person that I learn a lot from is Ellie Middleton. She has a couple of books out. One is called Unmasking, and the other is How to Be You. We'll put some links into how you can access Ellie Middleton's content. Thank you for listening today.